So it turns out that the Giga Chad guy, it turns out that this guy is a communist, or he has nostalgia for the DDR. GDR, made in GDR, right? And by the way, East Germans and Russians have a very profound closeness with one another for historical reasons, right? And this got like 4,000 likes, and the American lefties are so excited by it. They're like, oh my god, he's just like me! And they got so excited and happy at this news. They were like, they literally think that like this is who, like that guy is on their side. Like this is the representation of them. And that leftoids are the true Chads or whatever, right? I had to ruin the party. You know me. I had to ruin the fucking party, right? I completely shattered and destroyed this fantasy for them. You want to know what I did? Here's what I did. I said, stop assuming he's one of you, American leftoids. He's a real communist, which means very likely conservative, and would be considered a fascist right-winger here in America, just like I am, and Caleb is, and so many others are. In America, this guy would be 100% pro Dave Chappelle. This guy would be 100% not on board with gender criticism, wherever the fuck that is. He would be 100% a down-to-earth conservative guy, because that's how they are in Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe and in Russia. That's how communists are, right? They're very similar temperamentally, in terms of their mentality and in terms of their values, as are American conservatives. They're very similar, right? Continuing on, let's see where the current war stands. So this is 524, 513. Should I just address this argument first? Because maybe you guys like aren't sufficiently aware of why this is a stupid fucking argument. I'll explain it in a really simple way. So, very conservative does not mean you are criminalizing abortion or homosexuality, okay? And I don't know why this person is saying LGBT relationships when in the legal code in the GDR, they were talking about homosexuality, right? Regardless, this was a straw man from the very beginning, because I was not talking about LGBT or whatever. And it's weird that they're mentioning LGBT when all I said was pronouns in the bio. You know, the majority of leftists who have pronouns in the bio are cisgendered and straight. Okay, so I don't know what angle you're trying to come off when it comes to that. This is actually just not true in terms of any bearing on the conservatism, the overall conservatism of the German Democratic Republic, right? There's an assumption here, and I would call it the American exceptionalist notion of progress, which is inherited from Whig history. So the stereotype of Whig history is basically this idea that there's such a thing as linear progress, and the more shocking and provocative a new cultural trend or state policy is in regards to the status quo of society and culture, that is like an index of some like historical progress, that there's just it's just gonna keep on happening until, I don't know, we make furries become acceptable or something, and start fucking animals and make pedophilia normalized or whatever, right? This is actually not a materialist view, because from a materialist, this is a bourgeois Whig history notion of progress. So the American exceptionalist view of progress is basically this idea that all cultural realities are arbitrary, unreal, and do not have any substantive material grounding, and that as the passage of time increases, all of our cultural realities will increasingly become knocked over, and that all that is solid will melt into air finally until we have nothing but thought slime, jellyfish goo, and all of the stable, stratified, to put it in Deleuzian terms, structures of our society will dissolve, and everything will become gray goo, where we're all, pansexual, and we all have orgies all the time, and we become robots, and we basically enter a post-human future where we have artificial wombs, and all the things that we find shocking and unhuman and inhuman and offensive to the senses will eventually become completely normalized, right? So this sounds like the GDR was not conservative because back then they decriminalized homosexuality and they allowed for free abortions, right? And that means that if it was 2021, because time has passed, they would even be more progressive. But here's the thing, right? The materialist view will basically be, there's an upper limit to this. There actually is an upper limit to this so-called progress. And that limit is something called material humanity. It's called material humanity. There are objective human realities. There are objective material and human realities. That's the materialist view. You have to keep in mind something, that what this person is saying. Just because if you were LGBT or homosexual, you are not being put in jail. And he's saying that this is proof that GDR wasn't conservative. And he's also saying that because they had abortions, the GDR wasn't conservative. Well, abortion culture is also rampant in China. A given culture's tolerance of abortion is relative. Not every culture is going to have the same view or understanding of abortion. For example, in Peru and in Latin America, abortion has a very different significance than it does in China, for instance. But both are fundamentally conservative. Because conservatism is not about some kind of like immutable, transnational, and transhistorical values that are just preserved for their own sake. Conservatism in 2021 is specifically referring to this question of humanity. You are conservative because you believe in a material humanity that is not premised by arbitrary, liberal, individual wills. That's what it means to be a conservative today. To be a conservative today, or maybe in general, is basically the view that, even if you go back to the first conservatives like Edmund Burke and the people reacting to the French Revolution, who, by the way, Marx and Engels had a very ambiguous relationship to. Engels recalled in his assessment of the reactionary theorist Thomas Carlyle that Thomas Carlyle was just about the only human thinker that was available in the British canon at the time, or something along those lines. Engels was critical of Carlyle, of course. He appreciated the fact that Carlyle was not like some NPC. He actually had some kind of humanness to him, right? And Carlyle was an outright reactionary. He wasn't just a conservative, okay? We have to understand the meaning of conservatism here, right? Because a lot of people have this idea that conservatism means you're anti-gay and well, first of all, I want you guys to be very, I want you to like be very careful here in your understanding, because the GDR did not have an LGBT movement. Open, like very, very open and outward displays of LGBT was still considered taboo. It was considered taboo, especially in media and in movies. It wasn't until the very last days of the GDR, which was just this period of total liberalization, that you would find those things. And because this is something that also happened in the USSR. So Western NG, and I'm not saying this as an anti-LGBT guy, I'm just telling you the truth of the matter. Western NGOs and the people behind the color revolutions in Eastern Europe had so much power and sway over the course of the governments and society, the civil society at the time, which is basically the urban, conscientious, people who led the color revolutions. It appeared that the Soviet Union and the GDR during the 80s and late 80s became even more progressive than the West. But that wasn't because of communism. It was actually because of the total opposite. It was because of the complete wholesale liberalization. When you're talking just about the decriminalization, I was referring to in the late 80s, like the stuff about the movies that were finally like just about LGBT stuff, and it was becoming more visible, and that's what I'm talking about. It just being decriminalized. I need you guys to understand what decriminalization means. Decriminalization just means you're not throwing people in jail for it. I am not even anti-LGBT. My views are way more nuanced. I would say that the GDR was way more conservative than I am on this question. The plain truth is that there was no LGBT acceptance in the GDR. There was no promotion of LGBT. It was not something promoted in society. It was just something that wasn't criminalized, meaning you wouldn't go to jail for it. That doesn't mean they promoted it in their society. It doesn't mean it was considered acceptable by society. So the GDR was just extremely conservative by American standards. It was, exactly. It was tolerated but not promoted. I really think people need to roll back their expectations when it comes to this. But for me, this was not even about LGBT whatsoever. This was about having firm, strong, conservative values, such as a love of country, a sense of solid roots and belonging among your people, a sense of pride in your traditions, and a willingness to safeguard your history and your traditions, and even in a sense, your identity, your national identity, your patriotic country. country identity, right? These things were like given in the DDR at the time, regardless of, this legislation he's talking about. But this guy's trying to project this idea that in the GDR, you had like the equivalent of like American leftists wielding state power, and they were actually in power, and nothing can be further from the case. And this would all be way less sad when you take into account, and again, I'm not even saying I agree with this personally, but the GDR was an outlier compared to the rest of the Eastern Bloc. And the reason it was an outlier was precisely because it was the most Western country in the Eastern Bloc. In almost all the other communist states, it was not decriminalized. It wasn't decriminalized in the Soviet Union. I mean, why wasn't it? I don't understand. Why wouldn't it be? Well, the reason is because the GDR's proximity to the West and Western liberalism, especially when you're taking into consideration the pre-war legacy of the German communists. You also have to take into account the way in which the Communist Party in Germany gained power. It didn't gain in power on a mandate of the German peasants, like the Soviet Communist Party did. It gained power because of a war, which allowed the communist intellectuals to have way more like leeway in terms of experimentation with stuff than other communist parties were, right? But that was a bad thing, right? What was a bad thing? No, I'm just talking about the plain facts of the matter. Since this person wants to bring up, first of all, the category of LGBT was not recognized or legally valid, or it had no relevance in the GDR. What they were talking about was homosexuality, which was just not criminalized. If consenting adults had relationships, you're not going to go to jail for that. That's their policy, right? That doesn't mean in Socialist Croatia only in 1974. And Croatia, Tito's Yugoslavia as a whole was very liberal, right? This is a straw man argument through and through. From the very beginning, this was just a straw man argument. The fact, there's this, so we have to really break down this assumption that's being implied here that, oh, for its time, it was very progressive. But this implies a static and linear view of progress that implies a certain end. Every sense of progress implies an end. What is the ends of progress, right? If the GDR was progressive for its time, which means that in today, in 2121, they would have been even more progressive. And that over time, it's just, there's a line going up, and it's just more and more progress and acceptance. But to what end? What is the ends of that? Is what, as Marxists, as materialists, as people equipped with the materials dialectic, we have to interrogate this question. What actually is the ends of the so-called progress? Because how can progress be infinite when our material humanity is finite? Our culture is finite, in a sense. Now, culture changes, but culture does not change at the scale of rationalistic individual whims. You understand? Yes, history and culture changes, but it doesn't change because of voluntary will on the part of individuals. It doesn't change because individuals cast in a Cartesian way into doubt all cultural norms and decide to critique all of these norms and set them upon a new basis from the perspective of a purely individual or rational individual, right? They change according to a more organic process of the development of history and the material relations of production, which is something that is unconscious in its content and something which in terms of its scale happens gradually and over time. It doesn't happen because people say, well, why is it that women are the ones who have children and men are the ones who have sperm? Why is it that men are more masculine? Why is it that that's not how it fucking works though, right? Now, these people thinking in a way, they're like, well, Hans, you're just a conservative reactionary, and 100 years ago, you would have been a reactionary, and you would have said the same thing about women's suffrage. No, actually, that's not how it works, because there is no infinite linear progress. These things actually happen for reasons. Women's rights and this progressive things that are associated with the communist experience and modernity as a whole, I might add, these things have a finite significance. It's not just that as time goes on, society just became more progressive, leading to the end goal of the complete cultural equality and elimination of all differences between people. Actually, it was because what is implied by the modern subject being applied to all genders and all people regardless of their sexuality is this basic and minimal, and I'm writing a Substack about this. It's going to be called Marxism versus Americanism, right? And it's precisely about this topic. It's just that we do not make absolute assumptions. I'm actually going to stress this. I'm going to turn the music off so you don't get distracted. This is a very important point. The real historically revolutionary significance of modernity and women's rights and those kinds of things merely lies in the fact that we do not make absolute assumptions epistemically about the nature and role of women and men in society. What that means is that, let me explain it to you this way. In modern society, we have a different understanding and view of knowledge than people did before. In the past, people's sense of knowledge was highly intangible and intuitive and based in faith and based in some kind of sense of sublimity. It was not based on some kind of axiomatic, systemic sense of absolute certainty. So there came a confusion between truth, knowledge, and certainty. Now, knowledge in the past did not mean certainty. Because, let me give you, for example, the Islamic perspective, right? Certainty, from the Islamic perspective, all you can be certain in is God, and that there's one God. Now, you may have knowledge of the truth of traditional gender roles and all those things, but you're not certain that those things are eternal and those things exist for themselves. Only God knows, right? That's what you would say. It's just only God knows, right? It's in the hands of God. That's it. You're not certain about it. But after Western modernity, there is a clear confusion between knowledge and certainty, right? And with modernity, these old traditional roles were finally subject to the question. Now we have modern certain knowledge over the natural world and scientifically and so on, where it's a matter of life and death. We do have to be certain about some things in modern society, our modern technocratic modern society, because it's a matter of, quite literally, a matter of life and death for so many people. So many people are living today because we have some kind of like modern technical certainty over how, medicine works, or how even agriculture works, and how things along those lines are. Or think about astronauts on the ISS, or people in submarines. Those rest, that's a matter of life or death. So life is in the hands of some kind of certainty, right? With modernity, this is kind of also the meaning of all that is solid gets turned into air from the Communist Manifesto. All norms and all traditional values and all those kinds of things get subject to the standard and the rubric of the question of modern certainty, right? For example, the question arises, well, why can't women vote? If women want to vote, why can't they vote? If we are universal citizens and that we have this certain relationship between citizens and the state and the citizen votes in the modern society, why shouldn't this be extended to women? Well, if you were to respond to that by saying, oh, it's because women have certain immutable characteristics which disallow them from knowing what's best for themselves in order to, you are doing something that's not conservative whatsoever. You are making a pretense to a strictly modern sense of certainty. The emancipatory, if you want to call it that, I hate that word, significance of modernity merely lies in truly opening ourselves to things we don't know with certainty. It means we don't know with certainty what women's role is, what man's role is. We have no way of knowing this axiomatically, systemically, and with certainty. But here is where the problem of American bourgeois Americanism and the corresponding communist response enters in. With American bourgeois Americanism, you have a completely different view. It's not only that we are not claiming to know with certainty the nature of women's role and man's role and the nature of culture. You are also saying that, for example, the authentic expressions of sexuality and culture and gender that arise when we say we're not going to pretend we know with certainty, even if you don't know with certainty, some kind of natural, organic gender roles, healthy gender roles, are able to breathe and flourish. And people can get accustomed and used to these roles. And they're not being forced into them, but they authentically arise as the norm. Now, Americans take a step farther and they say, look at all of these particular and determinate expressions of culture and gender and tradition. These are the result of oppression. And this is a hidden oppression. And you ask them, well, is it a political oppression, as in people are being forced politically? Oh, no. It's not a political oppression. It's a form of cultural oppression. Now here, ladies and gentlemen, is the genesis and the origin of the American New Left and the counterculture. During the counterculture, there arose this idea that even beyond the modern bourgeois democratic equality, there's this hidden system of control and oppression that permeates private life, and that we must go out of our way to shatter the norms and break the ceilings and completely overturn the traditions, and so on, right? This is what is this is where the so-called linear progress that the leftists implicitly believe in, this is where communist states began to draw their line when it comes to embracing the progressive role of bourgeois democracy. They drew their line precisely here. The communist states responded to this by saying, no, that's not true. We may not impose and make assumptions about the nature of gender and culture from the perspective of the state, but we're not going to assume that all of our natural human realities are the result of some kind of hidden oppression and therefore try to overturn them or disturb them. So during the 60s and 70s, the communist states increasingly started to crack down. This actually let me actually really contextualize this historically. It's really after World War II, during the Stalin era after World War II, that you start to see the USSR crack down on jazz music and crack down on American foreign cultural influences. And you had a newfound with the Zhdanovchina, right? The leader of culture in the USSR, who was Zhdanov. He emphasized the decadent nature of bourgeois society and bourgeois culture and completely strove to root out these foreign influences from Soviet culture and from Soviet society. They said, we look at what's going on with America and its so-called progress, and we will not have any of it here. After Stalin died, Khrushchev and his clique embarked on some kind of liberalization and Americanization, right? So there was a little bit of lax when it comes to that. But ultimately, this was not because of the progressive movement of time or because communism was progressive in the American sense. It was because after the death of Stalin, you had a period of liberalization and an openness to American culture. So what does it actually mean to be a conservatism? Communist conservatism mostly rears its head in Zhdanovchina in the 40s and 50s. And it was primarily a response to American liberal cultural universalism. This is where communists thoroughly planted their feet in the ground and said, actually, we are conservatives in a fundamental sense. In a more fundamental sense, and in a way that is reconciled with modernity, communists are conservatives because we do want to preserve the traditions and the cultures and the heritage of our national histories and our civilizations and our cultures. We don't want to liquidate these things and embrace American universal cosmopolitanism and American culture and jazz music and all that kind of stuff. We do believe in a material humanity. Now, the reason they're not reactionaries is because they say this and also implying that they're reconciled with the fact that modernity itself is part of this continuity. The reason, this is the significance of Stalinism that's important to understand here. Stalinism is a form of kind of conservatism of Russian civilization. But the real significance here is it's basically saying this modernity is part of the history of the Russian civilization. It's part of our history. This very modernity, of technological modernity and change in the nature of gender roles where women are now educated and they have a choice, right? And they can enter the workplace and so on and so on. This is part of our culture, part of our heritage, and part of our history, right? This is the communist view. It's always been a straw man that conservatism was anti-modern. Conservatism was not anti-modern. Conservatism was merely a form of a critique against the hyper-idealist rationalism that of the European Enlightenment, which is a criticism shared by Marx. The German idealism was fundamentally conservative in nature in relation to European rationalism and the Enlightenment. And that is Marx's background. That's where Marx emerged from. Marx was himself fundamentally conservative in relation to the universalism of the bourgeois state. Marx pointed out how the bourgeois state attempts to impose an ideal of humanity upon the real and material humanity. It doesn't acknowledge that there's this antecedence of our material being that is not always already consolidated in the rational, bourgeois, and abstract state. So Marx was also a conservative in a fundamental sense. Conservatism doesn't mean you hate gay people and you want to criminalize homosexuality and, you're necessarily against abortion. Conservatism merely is an assertion that there is a fundamental material object and material being, human material being, that exists independently and in a way that is antecedent to our individual arbitrary wants, wills, and elevated sense of rationalism in relation to the world. Conservatism basically means you recognize there are things about our humanity, about our culture, about our nations, and about our heritage which cannot be liquidated. Now, can they change? Yes, they do change, but they change at a scale that is different than the impassioned crusader-like mentality of these leftists, fanatical individuals who want to, of the counterculture, who want to overturn all culture and overthrow the systems of hierarchy and patriarchy and oppression implicitly in culture. The communist attitude to culture is not that of the American counterculture and the New Left. The communist attitude toward culture is recognizing a material, fundamental material reality underlying culture. Culture is a kind of superstructure to the fundamental base of, for example, the relations of production. Not only the relations of the production of economic objects, but also our humanity, the reproduction of human beings in the form of the family. Now, Engels does talk about how the family is not something immutable. He talks about how, the bourgeois family has not existed for all eternity. But Engels wasn't saying that therefore that means families aren't real and that we can just go about voluntarily experimenting with new forms of the family No, there is an organic, almost natural evolution of families that happens at a scale very different from the individual intellectual, rational insight into the fact that they're not immutable. Just because you're saying this form of the family hasn't always existed and may very well change in the future doesn't actually mean that you could go about treating it as though it's not real. It's still real. Even if, just because it's not eternal, doesn't mean it's not real. Doesn't mean it's not a specific and determinate reconciliation of contradictions as they exist today. So this is why I talk about Heidegger and stress that kind of stuff. All it means basically is that there are unconscious material realities that exist independently and prior to the rational and conscious articulation of them. That's all I've ever said. And it's pretty much the same thing Marx said. It's just that Marxists in the West seem to have forgotten that, especially with Lukácsian notions of self-consciousness and so on, which, I don't want to bore you to death upon and waste too much time talking about. But we have to face this fundamental question, right? Is it that the cultural changes that have occurred since the counterculture and since the New Left, is this a result of some kind of objective historical progress? Or is it the result of a complete bourgeois psychosis and degeneration resulting from the material breakdown of the capitalist mode of production? My view is the communist line, which is that it's the latter. The Soviet Union, fundamentally, the communist states as a whole, whether they were considered revisionist or not, whether you're talking about Albania or China or the Eastern Bloc, all of these communist states had a vehemently opposed view to the American counterculture and the so-called cultural revolution of the United States. They were, not only were they extremely wary and skeptical of it, they sought to purge their societies of all of its influences just because they were modern societies that had a modern, and by the way, modern doesn't mean contemporary. Modernity is referring basically to this kind of process of emergence of the capitalist mode of production and bourgeois democracy, which had occurred a few centuries ago, or 3, maybe 4 centuries ago. They were modern states. They embraced the objective and material significance of modernity, so they were not trying to roll back the wheels of time when it came to those things. But that doesn't mean that this was because of some kind of linear, objective historical progress that culminates in bestiality and furries on Twitter and pedophilia and turning everyone into gray goo where nothing is real anymore and everything's just in polyamory and we're always yeah, that is not a Marxist or materialist view whatsoever, okay? So today, to be a communist, so what does this have to do with communism? Let's get right down to business about as far as what communism is about and what communism is concerned with. Now, communism is this Marxist sense of the word, the Marxist, Leninist, and so on sense of the word, shares in common with all the other socialisms and communisms in that it was attempting to address and give explanation to, give form to, give meaning to this common social object, right? Marx distinguished himself from the reactionary and conservative socialists of his time by recognizing that you cannot reverse or somehow dodge the impact of capitalist modernity. You have to go through it. There is an objective, real historical significance of capitalist modernity that we have to endure, we have to face, and we have to survive through. It's a challenge and test of our humanity. And Marx said this by elevating the proletariat as the privileged revolutionary class and subject of communism, because the proletariat was a class completely stripped of its traditional roots and its background. And to put it in Marx's own fucking words, it is a class that has been completely stripped of humanity and therefore represents the complete re-winning of humanity back. Marx was elevating the proletariat as the privileged subject because he was basically telling the conservatives and reactionaries of his time, guys, look upon the proletariat. Look upon this class that has been so thoroughly stripped of its humanity. Can you survive this class? Can you address this class? Can you make sense of this class? Marx was basically saying, we need to have faith in this class, because if we don't have faith in this proletarian class, we cannot have faith in reacquiring our sense of humanity after this process of capitalist modernity. Now, the Soviet Union and the communist states did reconcile themselves with capitalist modernity by pursuing an alternative form of modernity and a different path of modernity. A form of modernity which, while being destructive and apocalyptic in a sense, didn't lead to the wholesale liquidation and destruction of the humanity, culture, civilization, and national realities of its constituent, of the peoples that were victim to this modernity. It was reconciling this modernity. It sublated this modernity into a new type and new kind of civilization. Okay?